at a time when Al-Qaeda, which represents not only a threat to the West, but to moderate Islamic regimes throughout the Middle East, is clearly, in the eyes of many Muslims, it has the upper hand. And I think that one of the dangers that we may see coming as a consequence of any attack on Iraq is that there is an upswing of both Arab nationalism and support for more militant organizations such as Al-Qaeda. I think they will perceive it not being a legitimate attack in the sense of defending the United States and its allies from terrorism, but far more in the way of America attempting to impose its will on the Middle East, primarily for its own benefit and, of course, for the benefit of its ally Israel. And I think that that is a potentially explosive combination.
Charles Heyman?
Well, I think that Al-Qaeda is the major threat at the moment. Al-Qaeda are responsible for 9/11. Now, Iraq wasn't responsible for 9/11. Iraq at the moment is basically in its box. And the campaign against Iraq at this time, I think, tends to let Al-Qaeda off the hook a bit. It takes a lot of the focus of coalition military operations away from Al-Qaeda and a lot of that focus going elsewhere at a time when the focus really needs to be applied to Al-Qaeda, simply because there are some really, really sound advances being made against Al-Qaeda at the moment, and that momentum has to be kept up. I think that if an enormous amount of effort is put into Iraq in the next 6 months or so, then the momentum against Al-Qaeda will drop, and that could cause us some very serious problems.
What are your best estimates of what chemical and biological weapons Iraq has now, and also how far they are in the development of a nuclear weapon? Charles Heyman, you're the editor of Jane's World Armies. What's your best estimate?
My best estimate, and I concur basically with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, is that right at this moment in time, Iraq does not have the capability of projecting a nuclear weapon. It doesn't have nuclear weapons, and it doesn't have the ability to project a nuclear weapon, obviously, against one of its neighbors. Certainly there are probably residual stocks of biological weapons and chemical weapons left over from the previous Gulf War, and some of those stocks may have been enhanced very slightly during the last 10 years. But it's very, very difficult to use these weapons effectively in military operations. You have to have large amounts of artillery, usually to deliver them, and you have to have huge stocks, especially of chemical weapons, to put up a really effective barrage. And I don't think at this moment in time Saddam Hussein has really got that ability, both at the chemical weapon stocks, for instance, and at the large amounts of artillery that he needs to do that. When it comes to biological weapons, they are very, very, very tricky to use, and they can rebound on you very, very easily, and you never know what the real effects of biological weapons will be. Remember that one of the main effects of a weapon system is to stop the enemy in his tracks and cause maximum casualties as quickly as possible. You can't really do that with biological weapons. It might take some considerable time for the enemy to realize they're actually under any sort of biological attack. So these are difficult weapons to use in a conventional war scenario, and certainly Saddam Hussein doesn't appear to have the ability to strike out at his neighbors. I was in the Middle East a couple of days ago, and really the impression I get from everyone that no one feels themselves threatened, the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Syrians or the Turks, by Saddam Hussein. He is an obvious threat to Israel. He doesn't seem at this moment in time to be an obvious threat to his immediate neighbors.
Now, are you suggesting that if countries go in and attack Iraq, that Iraq will not use chemical or biological weapons against them because it's not really equipped to use them effectively?
Well, basically what I'm saying is that right at this moment there may be some residual stocks of biological weapons and chemical weapons in Iraq, but they don't appear to have the delivery means to project them out hundreds of kilometers into their neighbors' territory. They may be able to use them inside their own territory against troops who have actually moved inside Iraq and in small numbers, but certainly not out into the region. There are probably somewhere between about 12 and 20 Al-Hussein missiles with a range of about 650 kilometers, able to reach Israel from from Western Iraq. That really is probably the only delivery means they have, and it's very difficult to deliver biological weapons effectively on one of these missiles, and certainly terribly difficult to deliver chemical weapons because you need so much chemical down to create a sensible chemical barrage, and the warheads are just too small. Biological weapons, for instance, might well be destroyed on impact when the missile actually impacts. So, this is a difficult one for the Iraqis. I mean, they've got to square a very difficult equation here.
Mm-hmm. And Alex Standish, is there any intelligence that you're aware of that contradicts what Charles Heyman is saying?
No, not at all. I mean, it seems very clear that, as we all know, Saddam has a track record. He did use chemical weapons against, indeed, his own Kurdish population in 1988. But there really hasn't been credible evidence that there has been a massive rebuilding of any of those facilities which were dismantled under UN inspection during the 1990s. And certainly as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, the recent report that was interpreted, let's say, as suggesting by the Bush administration that he was only 6 months away from developing a nuclear weapon, in fact, I think was rather misrepresented. In fact, what the report said was at the time of the Gulf War in 1991, he had been between 6 months and 2 years away from developing a nuclear weapon. And indeed, the recent statement by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN body, indicated quite clearly that they do not believe that Saddam has any residual nuclear capability.
Charles Heyman, since you have to leave in a couple of minutes, I have a couple of questions very specifically about Iraq's army that I'd like to ask you about. First of all, if we do invade Iraq, what kind of army will we face? How much of the army has been rebuilt since the Gulf War?
Well, basically the army itself has been degraded since the Gulf War. One of their great problems has been getting spare parts and replacement ammunition, things like this, for all of the armoured vehicles, helicopters, all of the things that you need to run a modern army. So before the 1990-91 Gulf War, the Iraqi army was relatively powerful in the Middle Eastern context. Now today it has got a very, very seriously degraded capability with many of its main battle tanks, many of its military helicopters, armoured personnel carriers, artillery, all awaiting spares and not able to be used in the field. So they have a real problem. They're nowhere near as capable as they used to be.
What about Iraq's Republican Guard? During the Gulf War, they were always referred to as the elite Republican Guard because this was the most worthy force to be contended with. What's the status of this group now?
Well, the status of the Republican Guard is higher than the normal Iraqi army. The majority of the commanders have been appointed by Saddam Hussein. The Republican Guard take a priority on what spares they are that are available, and also, of course, they're better trained. They get a priority on training areas. They get a priority on everything across the board. So there's 5 divisions basically. 2 of those are tank divisions, and 3 of them are mechanized divisions. But again, they are nowhere near the readiness state and the offensive capability of a comparable NATO division. I mean, they are well down below that, and we didn't see them fighting desperately well during the 1991 Gulf War. Out in the open, there is no doubt whatsoever that this is a 1960s, 1970s force. That's how it's put together, and that's the sort of equipment it's got. It would be taken apart by coalition air power and coalition armor in any battle out in the open areas.
Now, Iraq is threatening urban warfare. What would that mean, and are they capable of doing urban warfare effectively?
Well, yes, they are capable of mounting a very dangerous urban warfare campaign, especially in a city like Baghdad, for instance, where there are 7 million people spread out over a very, very wide area. But there is absolutely no doubt that Saddam Hussein and his commanders will put their military assets that they want to use to try and delay or cause maximum attrition to a coalition force around places like hospitals and old folks' homes and kindergartens. And they'll make sure the television cameras are around as well. If you fight in a city, you have a much higher chance of taking casualties yourself. And of course, you've got the problem of collateral damage to very large numbers of civilians. I mean, imagine someone fighting their way through downtown Boston. I mean, it would be absolute mayhem for everybody involved. So no modern army, and no army in history really, has ever wanted to fight through a city. I mean, it's always safer and easier to try and starve people out than actually fight your way through the building. So that's a real problem for the coalition, and Saddam Hussein knows that.
How could Iraq engage the United States in urban warfare? The United States, for the past few years, has largely done air attacks. How would the Iraqi army lure our troops into the city?
Well, I mean, they can't actually lure them in. I mean, our troops can stand on the outskirts of the city and then make a calculated decision whether it is worth going into the city or whether it's worth, for instance, surrounding the city and cutting off all the movement in and out of the city, allowing all the civilians out and searching them bit by bit, and then starving out, the people who are left in the city, the soldiers and the members of Saddam Hussein's regime. I mean, that's an option. They would only go into the city if they felt that it was possible to go in and maybe get Saddam Hussein and the members of his regime that they want without massive casualties.
From your knowledge of Iraq's military, do you think there are a lot of very disenchanted, unhappy people in that military who will likely defect if we invade?
I think there are probably very, very large numbers of conscript soldiers inside the Iraqi army who want nothing to do with any war against the coalition, and they certainly don't want to fight for Saddam Hussein. They will disappear at the first opportunity. They won't necessarily defect, but if they have a chance, that they will probably go. And we would say that it's possible that 25% of the Iraqi army do not want to fight. There's another iffy bunch, is the best way to describe it, who will fight if they have to, but would rather not. There will be a small core of people inside both the Iraqi army and inside the Republican Guard who will fight. Now, the big question, and the $64,000 question here, is how many of those people will actually fight. Now, it will be a good percentage. There's no doubt about that. It's probably less than 50%, but that's probably the best sort of answer that I can give you at the moment.
From your point of view, what would it take to actually get rid of Saddam Hussein? What would it take militarily?
Militarily, if you want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, you would probably have to sit down and plan a classic conventional campaign whereby you actually attack, capture, and then occupy Iraq for some considerable time. You're probably looking, if you want to do it that way, of at least 250,000 troops. I mean, 5 to 6 US divisions, probably a UK division, and some more if you can get them along besides. Large numbers of aircraft, and probably large numbers of ships as well, to get people there and to provide aircraft and all sorts of air cover out into the theatre of operations. You might have to, for instance, assault and take the port of Basra and use that as a firm base to get troops and logistic supplies in, and to base your aircraft around the airfields that are adjacent to Basra. It would be a huge undertaking.
If you are wrong, and Saddam Hussein actually uses chemical or biological weapons against the opposing military, how effective, for instance, are the U.S. devices, gas masks and protective suits, how effective are those against biological or chemical weapons?
Well, they're very effective. They've been tried and tested, but what they do is they slow down the tempo of military operations almost to a halt. You can defend well when you're suited up against NBC threats, but it's very, very difficult to attack and keep any momentum going once you're under any sort of attack like that. I mean, and when I was in the military, and we practiced this constantly, and we found that we found it very, very difficult to keep tanks going, keep armoured personnel carriers going, things like that. and do it at the normal tempo.